Across New York City, many kingpins have come and gone, their empires crumbling and their stories buried. But here in the South Bronx, the name Blondie still endures after nearly 40 years. More than a hustler, more than a gangster, he became an urban legend whose presence still reverberates through these streets today.
Carlos Rafael Acosta was born on May 4, 1960 in Puerto Rico. As a pre-adolescent, he moved with his family to New York City, where they settled in the South Bronx. At the time, the area was amidst a severe economic decline, deteriorating into a poverty-stricken community dominated by public housing projects and plagued with crime, violence, and gang activity. From the moment Carlos arrived in Mott Haven, he was surrounded by the stark realities of urban decay, a blight that only deepened in the coming years.
His father wasn't involved in his life, and his mother would go on to have more children with another man. Since he was a boy, he was known as Blondie, a nickname born from his dirty blonde hair, and one that stuck with him forever. Growing up, he got into plenty of trouble. He was a wild kid who was known to be unpredictable and had a bad temper. By the time he reached junior high school, he was skipping class and began to forge a life in the streets. Mott Haven was one of the busiest heroin markets in all of New York City, and many Puerto Ricans were involved in dealing it. Since the 1940s, Puerto Ricans worked with Italian heroin traffickers in the Lower East Side and East Harlem, which led to a long tradition of their involvement in the dope trade.
Throughout the early 1970s, crime and drug activity in the South Bronx continued to surge, transforming the area into one of the poorest and most violent neighborhoods in the United States. Heroin flooded Mott Haven, and addicts could be found loitering on nearly every other corner. Just blocks away from Acosta, a young thug 4 years his senior named George Calderon was carving out a reputation of his own and would one day become notorious in the South Bronx. Calderon ran closely with a friend of his named George Gomez, a fellow hoodlum from Cypress Avenue, and together the pair carried out a wide range of criminal activities. In 1973, Calderon was sentenced to a prison term, and by the late 70s, his partner George Gomez had risen up the street ranks and was now known as Money George. George began leading a gang called the Cypress Boys, a rugged squad who took part in stick-ups and burglaries and also extorted local businesses and drug dealers. Blondie was another Puerto Rican who got his hands in the dope trade, and that was also when he joined the Cypress Boys.
As he honed his craft, he also began selling cocaine in addition to heroin, and expanded to right here on Cypress Avenue and East 140th Street. At that time, he also began staying in an apartment in a building at 637 East 140th Street in the Diego Beekman houses, which was one of the most impoverished and drug-riddled public housing complexes in the Bronx.
During the late 1970s, Blondie was running drug sales on and around East 140th and Cypress, an area where junkies gathered day and night, and police considered it one of the busiest heroin locations in the Bronx. Calderon was released after serving a little over 7 years of his sentence and got involved with the Cypress Boys and Blondie, helping to maintain their interests but also trying to make his own way in the South Bronx underworld.
On December 22, 1980, Acosta was arrested on a burglary charge for allegedly bursting into the apartment of a man who lived on East 140th Street and making off with $1,700 worth of electronic equipment.
Then a few weeks later, on January 11, 1981, a 5-alarm fire broke out in his building in the Beekman houses. The fire engulfed the 6-story structure for several hours before being extinguished. The top 2 floors collapsed, and under the rubble, firefighters later uncovered a body burned beyond recognition, which would soon be identified as a 62-year-old man named Marcin Mason.
A preliminary investigation showed that the fire was deliberately set, and some residents had described Acosta as being the culprit and said that he had mentioned setting the blaze.
3 days later, he was arrested and charged with arson and murder. However, a department report determined that the building violated numerous fire safety standards and the flames may have spread through construction holes made in the walls. The Beekman houses had been plagued with arson fires like many buildings in the Bronx at that time, which were mostly instigated by landlords for insurance fraud. With several factors pointing to other possible causes, charges against Acosta were ultimately dismissed. With Money George and the gang backing him, Blondie would muscle in on drug dealers on Cypress Avenue and took over their locations with little resistance. He was equal parts gangster and hustler and always carried a gun, which he wouldn't hesitate to use if necessary. Soon he had a chain of spots running all along Cypress, and one of the main products he dealt was a brand called Green Tape. By the summer of 1983, 23-year-old Carlos Blondie Acosta was rising the ranks and achieving prominence in the South Bronx streets and separating himself from his contemporaries. By now, the Cypress Boys had earned a fearsome reputation throughout Mott Haven. Other members of the crew included Money George's brother Gomez, Calderon's half-brother Al, as well as local kids named Hector, Ace, and Ishmael. They continued to rob, extort, and intimidate others, and there were people who would hide when they saw them coming down the block. But far from the only gangsters in the South Bronx, not everyone was willing to be worked over by their strong-arm tactics, and soon their ways would catch up with them.
On the morning of September 12, 1983, Money George was sitting in a car near St. Mary's Park with Ishmael and a woman named Melinda when a gunman approached the vehicle and began shooting it up with a machine gun. Gomez and Melinda died on the spot while Ishmael was rushed to the hospital in critical condition.
Police interviewed Ishmael, but he refused to name the person who shot him, and he died from his wounds a few days later, taking the identity of the killer with him. During the course of the investigation into the murders, Blondie surfaced as a person of interest.
Some claim that the Cypress Boys and Blondie had a falling out shortly before this, but exactly why isn't clear. One allegation is that the gang thought he was getting ahead of himself, while others claim that Money George may have been trying to take a big cut of his drug sales. This led to some suspicion being pointed in Blondie's direction for possibly being involved in the triple homicide, and he was detained in a local jail as a suspect. But with insufficient evidence connecting him to the murders, he was eventually released and immediately returned to his drug trade. Although it's undetermined if Blondie had any complicity in the killings, the brazen ways of the Cypress Boys had resulted in numerous enemies, and several people were gunning for them. Until this day, it's never been publicly revealed who was behind the murders of George, Ishmael, and Melinda, and what the true motives were.
In the coming year, Blondie rose to power as the dominant drug boss of the area. He had a stronghold on heroin and cocaine sales on Cypress Avenue, with a number of employees under him. He was earning major profits, and ever the street entrepreneur, he was looking to expand his operation, particularly 2 blocks over to Brook Avenue.
Here at East 139th Street and Brook Avenue was prime real estate and a coveted location for hustlers to be at, and those who worked these corners often got a certified stamp of street cred. There would be different kingpins in charge here over the years, and in the near future, Calderon would be running this intersection. Blondie eventually made his way here, and from there on out, his rise in the drug trade was meteoric, due to both his business savvy and the heroin brand he was selling. He was selling a highly touted brand called Airborn, which was known as quality smack and a favorite amongst junkies. Airborn was in high demand, and most dealers who sold it quickly shot up to street stardom.
Blondie was tight with a young hustler from Brook Avenue named Will Klassen, who was known as Will Love. Since childhood, he was close with Will and his family and had lived in their home for a period of time. By the middle of 1986, crack had spread across New York City, and soon the South Bronx was overrun with the drug, although the area always maintained its foothold as a major heroin market. With the crack epidemic exacerbating the already crime-ridden neighborhood, violence and murders skyrocketed in the South Bronx. Seeing an opportunity to capitalize off the popular drug, Blondie added crack as another product in his sales inventory. During this period, there was another Puerto Rican hustler from the Bronx rising fast in the heroin business. A motivated 17-year-old named George Rivera, who was nicknamed Boy George, was managing a sales location on East 166th Street and Washington Avenue in the Morrisania section. He worked for Victor and George Torres, two brothers who ran the biggest heroin ring in the South Bronx and sold a brand called Checkmate.
Blondie was now in control here at 139th and Brook, and along with his string of spots on Cypress Avenue, he was raking in the dough. He ran a structured operation where he employed managers to oversee the dealers, lookouts to alert the dealers to law enforcement, and steerers to direct customers to the dealers. He set forth rules that his employees were to strictly abide by, such as reporting to their shifts on time and to never rob or intimidate customers.
Blondie lived fast and spent big, draped in designer clothes, expensive jewelry, and behind the wheel of luxury cars, including his prized Cadillac. He maintained a disciplined lifestyle and never used drugs and rarely drank alcohol. From early on, he built a reputation as both respected and beloved in his neighborhood and gave money to those in need. But like many crime figures, he embodied duality, generous and loyal to friends and family, but had a reputation as being devious and had a ruthless streak in business dealings. In a place where money and respect meant everything, area kids saw him as more than a man, they saw him as an icon. Ever the playboy, by now he had fathered several children with different women. By this time, his former Cypress Boys colleague Calderon had partnered up with his cousin Angel Coulson Padilla. They oversaw a crew and began to build an extortion racket in the area in which they charged dealers a street tax to operate on the turf. In June of 1987, the Torres brothers were taken down by the feds, and afterwards Boy George became the man in charge. He began selling a popular heroin brand called Obsession, and sales quickly took off at 166 in Washington, and he would soon open up more spots. Boy George was looking for a piece of the action on Brook Avenue, and that was when he connected with Will Love. They teamed up, and along with a squad of hustlers known as the Obsession Crew, they began selling in an abandoned building which ran from 140th to 139th Streets on Brook Avenue and was known as The Hole. Through Will, Blondie and George were introduced, and the two quickly hit it off with each other.
During this time, there was a vagrant alcoholic named Geraldo Oquendo Vega who roamed the streets of Mott Haven, but was very well liked by local residents, including Blondie. On the evening of July 14, 1987, a store owner named Juan Roman pulled out a knife and repeatedly stabbed Geraldo several times, and he died from his wounds. It's unclear why Roman stabbed him. Some news articles say that they had an argument, while others say that Roman was simply fed up with him being in and around his store. Blondie and other locals were outraged by this, and police had to save Roman from an angry mob of people while he was being arrested.
Afterwards, a makeshift shrine was placed at the scene of Geraldo's slaying. Blondie paid for a graffiti mural dedicated to Geraldo, which was put up around the corner on 139th. The mural said, "Geraldo, we love you," and was signed "From Blondie, R.I.P." By the fall of 1987, Calderon's venture was temporarily sidetracked when he was sentenced to another prison term for a parole violation. He relayed instructions to Couson, who stepped in his absence as they continued to try and take over nearby blocks to expand their extortion scheme. Blondie and Boy George became a dynamic pair of associates and had the dope sales on lock on Brook Avenue from 139th to 140th Street and were pulling in tens of thousands of dollars per week.
With some of his earnings, Blondie opened up a small food spot on 139th that had video arcade games that local kids would come play. He was a neighborhood celebrity, often spotted on the block, posted up with hustlers and everyday folks alike.
His status in the neighborhood also drew a crowd of opportunists and hanger-ons, eager to bask in his influence. In October of 1987, another child of his was born, a son who he named Blondie.
In early November 1987, it's claimed that Blondie had gotten into an altercation with a local 18-year-old nicknamed Junebug. Rumor has it that Junebug worked for him and had robbed some customers who came from out of town, with this being a breach of business protocol to violate customers. When word of this got back to Blondie, he assaulted Junebug for this infraction, and Junebug in turn threatened him.
That same day, Blondie was arrested on an unrelated charge, but was quickly released. The next day, on the afternoon of November 5th, 1987, Blondie entered 520 East 137th Street in the Millbrook houses and took the elevator to the 8th floor. When he exited the elevator, a gunman ambushed him and shot him in the back of the head. "27-year-old Carlos Blondie Acosta died on the spot.
But he wasn't the only victim of the assailant. When police arrived, they found two other people shot dead alongside him.
The people killed with Blondie were a 20-year-old friend of his named John Marrero and a 68-year-old man named Jamie Rodriguez. The word on the streets is that they were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the perpetrator had to eliminate them as witnesses. Many local residents showed up to Blondie's funeral services to pay their respects.
With police aware of the incident between Junebug and Blondie just a few days earlier, they immediately honed in on Junebug as the main suspect. The day following the murders on November 6, 1987, Junebug was arrested and charged with 3 counts of second-degree murder. It doesn't appear that there was strong evidence connecting him to the homicides, but police had tunnel vision due to his recent altercation with Blondie. Many from the neighborhood insisted that police had arrested the wrong person for the triple homicide and argued that Junebug's clash with Blondie was nothing more than bad timing.
People began gossiping about the murders, and theories were swirling through Mott Haven. Some heard that it was vengeance carried out by someone who Blondie had ripped off in a drug deal, while others thought it may have been revenge for one of his other misdeeds.
While others believed that Blondie's death was a calculated move, a hit meant to clear the way for control of 139th and Brook Avenue. If so, then the rumors may hold a kernel of truth, that the other 2 killed that day were nothing more than collateral damage.
Soon after his death, a mural dedicated to Blondie was spray painted on a wall on East 139th Street. It was put next to Geraldo's mural. Boy George carried on at Brook Ave, and by this time he had opened up several more obsession spots in the Bronx and East Harlem. George's reign continued until April of 1989, when he and the obsession crew were taken down. Rivera later received a life sentence without parole.
After Blondie's death, another drug lord known as Grande took over 139th and Brook. When Calderon returned from prison in 1990, he initiated a takeover of Grande's territory, but rather than engage in a violent war with him, he conceded his turf and moved back to Puerto Rico. Calderon, Couson, and their crew, known as the CNC Gang, controlled 139th and Brook and the surrounding avenues, where they ran an extortion racket, up until Calderon was killed in May of 1992. Junebug was convicted of charges related to the murders and received an indeterminate sentence, but would wind up being released from prison in the late 1990s.
In the years following Blondie, Grande, and Calderon's reigns, many others sought to cash in on the cutthroat yet fertile crossroads of 139th and Brook. But like those who came before them, their ventures brought quick riches and equally swift downfalls.
Blondie's reign at the top of the drug trade was short, but in those few years, he carved out the kind of respect that blurred the lines between protector and predator. In the end, he became a symbol of a familiar South Bronx paradox, the dichotomy of power and vulnerability, of reverence and violence, the type to shield his community from outsiders, even as he exploited it from within. His murder closed the chapter, but his presence still lingers in whispered stories and the scars of a neighborhood that both loved and feared him. He was only 27 when his life was cut short, gunned down inside the same buildings that once chanted his name. Blondie's life was brief, his street legend enduring, and like so many before him, the man and the myth remain inseparable.